what they're currently doing, but what we think they could be doing more of. So whether there are gaps in the industry. In terms of representation, we said that generally literary journals are quite good for representing underrepresented writers, but that's not always the case. And obviously we're looking at maybe more indie-leaning magazines, but we can also look at the large literary magazines, and perhaps there's something that they could be doing to lead the industry that they're not currently doing. So I wonder what you thought about that.
So I think in terms of representation, like you say, a lot of magazines are doing a lot, which is excellent. I think lit mags are a really good route to the industry for underrepresented writers, because it is just more accessible. I think in terms of maybe diversity, there are things that we could be doing more of. I know, speaking for myself, with Idlink, I'm very much a one-man band, and that is mostly because of financial reasons. I just can't afford to bring more people on to read submissions and things like that. I do work with a group of reviewers that will do book reviews for me, but aside from that, it is just me reading submissions. So I think I can try as hard as I possibly can to represent all types of writers and all types of stories, but I'm sure I have blind spots. We're all human. So for me, ideally, what I would like to do in the future is, if it becomes financially possible, to bring on a more sort of diverse panel of people to help me read submissions and make sure that we're magnifying all types of voices, because we can always do better, right? So that's one of my goals for the future that I think a lot of litmos could be doing as well. But we are just so sort of hamstringed in terms of finances, because, as I was saying earlier, everything's free to read, but that means that we're not making any money, so we can't employ people. So it's a bit of a push and pull at the moment, but I think that's the main thing that we could do, really, is have more diverse readers looking at submissions.
I have kind of a potentially controversial take on this, particularly when it comes to like larger literary journals, because there's this really neat party line of saying that they have the intention of representing new to the industry writers, but then there's this really odd habit of repeatedly publishing names that are not new to the industry by any stretch of the imagination, and in fact names that like already very much have a following, very much have kind of a portfolio of published works. And I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying that those writers and artists should be penalised for being popular, i.e. don't publish them because they've already had their turn on it. I don't mean that by any stretch, but I do think that for an industry, I suppose, that kind of champions this idea of, yes, you can be a writer, yes, you can put yourself out there, yes, you can find a home for your work, it doesn't always feel like, I suppose, like the lit journal's equivalent of the big five or the big four, as it is these days in publishing. It doesn't always feel like the lit journal's equivalent to that are necessarily kind of, oh God, I'm shooting myself in the foot here, but pulling their weight. I don't think, when it comes to championing writers who are new to the industry. And I've, again, this is one of those instances where, like, I'm aware of like writer friends who probably aren't even classed as new to the industry at this point in their careers, who find that they're constantly being batted back by the same bigger lit journals, who are constantly saying, but please resubmit. And you know, when somewhere where you really want to be published says, but please do resubmit, of course you'll resubmit, because you're literally being encouraged to, only to then have kind of anywhere between 4 and 10 rejections by the same set of editors, let's say, and either, I don't know, maybe you get published, or maybe you just give up one of the two options, depending on kind of, I suppose, how robust you happen to be feeling about whatever it is you're submitting. So I do think that there is more to be done by kind of bigger lit journals when it comes to making sure that there is a fairer balance, perhaps, between writers who have quite a strong portfolio or quite a strong CV versus, you know, like my students, for example, who might be sending off really, really good work, but might be doing it for the first time ever. So they don't necessarily have the most impressive bio to send with it.
You know, like, to play devil's advocate, I think I know what you're talking about. You see the established writers being published in like the Poetry Review, Poetry London, I don't know, Rialto, maybe not so bad, but you know, Rattle, that kind of thing. And you think, you know, you kind of know that there are spaces reserved for those writers, and you kind of see their publication come around at the same time that their second collection is published in bookshops, and you're like, oh, how did that particular flagship poem get in there? Isn't that the title of your new book? And you know that like their publicists got them into that. But then to play devil's advocate, that I can kind of, I feel like maybe our outrage is because of the wording of that website saying, you know, we champion all writers, all stages, equal opportunities. But whereas if they maybe fairly said, you know, we have a certain amount of spaces that we reserve for maybe the poets of the moment, you know, poets who have a book coming out, because we sort of recognize that, particularly in the poetry world, or perhaps, you know, novellas, short fiction, whatever that journal is mainly championing, you know, is not represented in the mainstream media. So we reserve a certain amount of spaces for reviews and features of those writers, which does maybe reduce our opportunity to showcase newer writers, but it's sort of like the ecosystem. It'll come around and maybe these poets will rise to the top, and then we'll put them in our like top spaces and that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know if it's us thinking, you know, that they've been dishonest, if you like.
I think disingenuous is probably the way that I would phrase it. But yeah, I would actually feel less put out, I suppose, if they were kind of transparent with this idea of, you know, we do have a certain amount of space that's reserved for, I'm not saying they need to name their top shelf poets or anything quite as transparent as that, but certainly we do have a certain amount of space available for X poets versus the space that's kind of publicly available, I suppose. Yeah, I think to me it would make more sense. And I know I'm kind of veering us into our conversation about sort of literary journals and literary editors as like gatekeepers of publishing. So I realise I'm taking us a step ahead, but I suppose that's why I have such feelings about it, is because it feels a little who's got the keys to that kingdom sort of experience. And I guess, particularly as someone who teaches creative writing, I just really don't like the thought of my students having to hoop jump, essentially, I suppose would be the best way of phrasing it, or kind of do their due diligence of getting rejected so many times before they eventually get accepted. It sometimes feels less about the quality of work and more about an endurance test for how much you really want to be published in a certain magazine.
I think when I was starting out, which was like 10 years ago now, just submitting my work out, I had a spreadsheet, so I kept track of how many places rejected a certain piece, and I'd be like rejected by like 10 plus places. And I didn't know what I was doing. Like, I never studied creative writing or English or anything, and I didn't really have friends who were writers. And when I look back, what I was doing was kind of wrong, you know, like I wasn't writing the cover letter properly. I was kind of gushing too much. I'd just be like, oh my God, I love your journal, it's amazing, please publish me. And obviously there's no right or wrong, but we kind of know that there's an accepted way of doing stuff. And I just wish places would make that more clear on their website and just be helpful, like maybe give like a sample cover letter, you know, and or just maybe a sample successful submission with like that poet's consent. And because it's just that I had no idea what I was doing, and it felt like such an impossible task getting into that world. And the first journals that I got into were ones that they were mainly online, and they were, thinking back, I think they were all kind of edited by women and just felt more accepting and kind of more welcoming.